Leading Organizations That Matter, a podcast about leadership, organizational culture, and how we find meaning and purpose in our work. I'm your host, Ray Spadoni, and today's topic is now the time to consider executive coaching? Let's say you are at a point of significant change in your life and career. You are facing a difficult decision or situation. You'd like to take your career up to the next level. You feel as though you are facing insurmountable challenges and would like to explore ways to overcome them. Might this be a good time to consider executive coaching? Today, I'm pleased to interview Ted Witherell, who has dedicated more than 30 years to developing leaders and cultures. He is the principal of Ted Witherell Coaching and Consulting and a lecturer on leadership at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He works with leaders and teams from mid-level management to senior executive level, and he specializes in physician leadership. As a business executive, Ted led the talent management function at Mass General Brigham Healthcare System for more than 25 years. In that role, he was a trusted advisor. He provided advice and counsel on executive coaching, change management, team development, training, and leadership development. A couple of highlights from his background that are particularly relevant to today's conversation include he's been a panelist and speaker for forums like Becker's Healthcare Forum and the American College of Healthcare Executives. He served on the steering committee of the National Center for Healthcare Leadership and chaired their coaching council. He holds a coaching credential from the ICF, the International Coaching Federation, and has completed 2 additional executive coaching certificate programs. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the podcast, Ted. Thank you very much for being a guest here.
Glad to be here. I'm excited, actually. It's going to be a good conversation.
Fantastic. So I introduced listeners already to you before we started recording at a high level, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your path to becoming a coach, to becoming an executive coach.
Yes, absolutely. It's really interesting. I think I've always been a coach on one level. My first formal coaching role, I was 14 years old and I was coaching a Little League team with my buddies in high school. Right, I was a track coach for a while. So it's kind of always been there in one level. There are a couple moments. One moment was when I was doing some volunteer work with a Peace Corps type organization in Kingston, Jamaica, and I realized that my gift to the world was not going to be as the leader, as the one doing stuff, but the person next to the leader. And what I really realized was that I was going to do that and I'm going to make that contribution most likely through some form of counseling and teaching. Those were going to be the 2 things. And those have been present all the way through my journey. I have a master's in counseling, did some employee assistance counseling for a period of time. I have been a classroom teacher. I'm a college professor, right? But really, this counseling and teaching has shown up in lots of various ways, never more poignantly than in coaching. So it was around the 90s when coaching started to become a thing. I got kind of interested in it, did a little bit of research on it. And the more I looked at it, the more I went, so that's what they call it, this thing that I've been doing.
Interesting.
So then, fast forward, I ran the talent function at Mass General Brigham for about 25 years. And in that space, I kept bringing coaching into it there, doing coaching, running the internal coaching practice, getting my own certifications. I have a couple of certifications in coaching. I have the ICF credential. And that sort of led me to where I am now, where I have my own practice. So that's
Great.
the journey.
Thank you. What do you think exists within you in terms of what makes you tick that drew you to coaching, that drew you to being, in a supportive role rather than the hub around which all the other spokes rotated? You wanted to be supportive of the hub. What is it about you, do you think, that drove you to it?
What a great question. You'd be a good coach, right? Because coaches ask questions. It's as I presented in this short snippet that I just gave to you, it sounds so much more clean and clear than it really was or is. for me, and certainly I think for anybody. It's there's always a more of a knitting together in the after fact. But I think part of it was really coming to grips with what my gifts were. There was a desire to be the inspirational leader, and I kind of started to realize that I'm not necessarily. It doesn't come naturally to me to be that. I've been in that role and I've done that certainly. So one was kind of accepting that. Then the other was going to that place of like, oh yeah, but I've always been the one that people trust and want to kind of speak to and sort of gain advice from, but I've always been the one that's curious and really enjoy kind of understanding what's going on for somebody else, and I'm curious and ask the questions. So I think it was really a process of kind of uncovering that in myself. And as I said, it was sort of an epiphany kind of early on, and that epiphany kept getting more and more clear as I got more and more mature.
Great. Thanks for answering that, Ted. It gives us some insight into you, and also the kind of person who would become an executive coach. And so when
Mm,
some folks hear the term executive coach, they're going to think perhaps that the term itself is sufficiently descriptive. An executive coach coaches executives. Fine, but I am sure that there's more to it than that. Can you provide a description, what it is, and maybe just as important, what it isn't?
sure. That's great. Yeah, great question. A great place for us to start the conversation. So a couple of things. I think first of all, I love the fact that you kind of put a fine point on executive coaching, because there are different kinds of coaching, and I won't bore you by kind of getting into that. But I do think, for example, there's a big difference in terms of what happens in and what is visual, what people think of when they think of a quote life coach versus a quote executive coach, right? And there's a lot of overlap, but I think there's a difference primarily in the context that we're talking about. Executive coaching is a type of coaching, but it doesn't necessarily mean only coaching the person who has an executive title. Right? So I see a couple of things. The International Coaching Federation, I mentioned them a little bit earlier. They're the gold standard. They kind of set the standard for what the field is. So here's a quick sentence from what they say that I think is a good place to start. They talk about partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Right? Those are the words, right? But there's a lot in there, and I think for me, I like to think of it in a metaphor, a road trip. So if I'm coaching you, we're going on a road trip, and you get to decide what the destination is. Are we going to go across country? Or are we going to just go down to DC? You get to decide. You're driving. You're behind the wheel. And I'm your partner in this. I'm your passenger. And you get to tell me, I want you, Ted, as my passenger here, I want you to be on radio duty. I want you to watch for the police because I tend to speed. Or I want you to take a nap in the back seat because I got this, right? So that's the way I kind of think of it. And there are a few ingredients that I think are really, really important in coaching. There has to be a level of inquiry, curiosity, questioning. And I bring that up because I think the temptation for most other forms of related to others like this, take the form of telling. I know something I should tell you. That's what we kind of go to. That's a knee-jerk default reaction. Coaching is much more about asking questions that help you discover the truth. I won't go into the brain science band, but there's a lot that basically says that's a much more impactful way of kind of being for you. And then the other thing that a coach does, besides asking, the coach helps hold a space for reflecting. If I ask a good question, you need to be able to have the space to be able to unpack what that means. One of the things that I've noticed is a huge deficiency in all the people I work with these days is the time for reflection, the discipline of reflection. I will often ask someone, how do you process inspiration? And most folks don't have a standard kind of way of that, right? So can coaching create that space? So two ingredients are this notion of inquiry and a notion of reflection. And of course, implicit in this is a goal. I have two beliefs around this. One is the 2% belief. That is, I believe when I'm coaching you, that you are really working on a 2% tweak, not a 98% wholesale remake of who you are. Most of the time when I'm coaching someone, there is some kind of a thing that's holding them back from what they want, what they need to get. And usually that takes the form of a strength overplayed. This worked where I was before, now it's not working where I need to go next. The other belief I've got, I think, that is really important here around that I think defines coaching is you have what you need. ICF talks about, the person in front of you is creative and resourceful and whole. When I've been least effective as a coach, it's when I've lost sight of that belief that you have everything you need. All I'm doing is trying to help you figure that out.
That's great.
So that's the gist. That's the gist. I'll stop there. I can go on and on, Ray, because I love this coaching stuff. But let me stop
Yeah.
there.
No, that's great. And I will say that anyone who knows me knows that I'm a sucker for a good road trip metaphor. So, um, I use them often myself. But when you mentioned the question, how do you process inspiration? That's very powerful. And I would not be surprised if many of the listeners to this podcast, hearing you ask that question or state that as something you like to ask, pause for a moment and maybe even drift off into trying to answer that question for themselves. I did that myself a little bit, to be honest with you. Other good questions. I want to circle back to that a little later in the interview, because I think you're exactly right. It's the art of asking good questions is a very valuable one. We've looked at this so far, Ted, from the perspective of the coach. Let's look at it from the perspective of someone who might be thinking, "Hey, uh, maybe I'd like to have a coach." So, who's a good candidate for coaching? And maybe even one step further, at what stage of a person's career should someone even consider bringing on a coach in the first place?
Great question. I would again, you're good with the questions, Ray. Um, you must be like a podcast host or something, I'm sure.
I dabble.
um,
Yeah.
you dabble. um, Atul Gawande is one of my heroes. Many of your listeners may have heard of Atul Gawande. He writes for the New Yorker. He's a big kind of a thought leader. He's also a faculty member at Harvard Med School and Harvard School of Public Health. He's a surgeon. He's written books. He says that everyone needs a coach. And
Hmm.
his article called Everyone Needs a Coach really kind of revolutionized the acceptance of coaching in the medical establishment. He basically said, I'm a physician, I'm a surgeon, in fact, and I use a coach. And so that was one example of, and I've seen this happen in various fields, where it became okay for folks to ask for a coach, seek a coach, accept coaching where they wouldn't have before. So my first answer is that everyone at any time, needs a coach. My second response would be anyone who is worthy of investment. And that's, one of the things that we may get to, I'm sure, is kind of around, okay, what are some of the downsides, around coaching? What are the pitfalls? Well, coaching is, I'm going to say it's an expensive intervention. And I don't want to kind of overstate that, right? Because it is an investment. When I was inside running the talent management function, I would have folks say they wanted to get a coach for a person they're about to fire. And that is not a good use of coaching. That person is not coachable. That you're talking about remedial situation here. That's not good for coaching. It's also not worth putting that kind of. If basically the organization is saying, I simply want to show that I'm invested in this person before I fire them, there are a lot cheaper ways to do it. So I think part of it is these are the people we want to invest in. I had a wonderful CFO who once said he talked about leverage. So I want to pay for coaching for anyone for whom there is leverage. In my experience, that falls into a couple of buckets. One is the higher up that someone goes in an organization, the larger their leverage is, right? The more people they impact, the more of the culture they have a say over,
Right.
et cetera. So investing there is a really great place. More importantly, though, I believe investing in those high potentials, the folks who are earlier in their career, who really, really have a place to go. Let's invest in them early, because an investment there can pay dividends for a very long time. So that's part of it. I think the other thing I would say is anyone who is in any inflection point. Inflection points are such a valuable point because we are unfrozen, right? Coaching often is about changing the way that we sort of think about something. When we are unfrozen, think about, for example, when you go on that road trip, when you're on vacation, you're unfrozen from your daily routine. You're open to things in a way you wouldn't be otherwise. Also, transitions create a sense of stress. Eustress, not distress. Distress actually kind of brings us down to a lower order thinking, but eustress is actually a great place that motivates us to alleviate that stress and learn and create. So times of inflection points are really, really powerful. The last thing I'll say around this, the most important thing in terms of figuring out who coaching is for, is readiness. Are you ready for it? And I have a whole lot of research and a lot of thesis kind of around readiness that I think is really, really valuable and important. To me, it comes down to skill, will, and environment, right? When we look at those, are the conditions present in that space for the person to be successful. And that willingness is kind of speaks to their readiness. Are they ready for this?
Got it. That's a very helpful way to frame this up. And I think, you keep asking good questions. So that's, your Jedi level coaching is on full display for the audience. But I'm struck by the question or by the notion of investment, someone who's worthy of investment. And, I wonder about the inverse of that. If you're someone who's contemplating executive coaching, you have to ask yourself if you are worthy of that investment. The inverse being, well, what does it say if you don't feel you are worthy of that investment? I mean, not to go too deep into, the psychology of this, and I know there's a lot of psychology baked into this, but um, I think that strikes me as a first marker, as a sort of the gate. If you feel you're worthy of investment, then proceed. If you don't, maybe time to examine and really probe that a bit.
Great insight. 100% agree. I think that to me that speaks to two things when I was talking about readiness, right? That's part of it. I have to feel on some level I'm worthy enough, right? And I think that's one of the challenges, right? Like because the challenge in coaching may be my sense of worthiness, right? And that is, by the way, one of the most common areas of coaching that I engage in with folks. They'll appear and they'll talk about confidence, and sometimes they're so inconfident they won't even be able to kind of really frame it in that way. One of the most common ways that folks come forward is imposter syndrome. And I find this in particular a number of women clients. That's a very common thing that shows up, especially a lot of my physician clients who find themselves in roles of leadership. This notion of imposter syndrome. They'll find out that I'm a fake, and I can go down a list of 20 different clients that I've got who are these amazing, accomplished human beings, and I'm saying, really? You don't see that, right? But the work is around helping them to come see that.
Interesting, the some of the differences. Maybe it's between men and women, maybe it's just between different types of folks, but this notion of worthiness, and then also confidence in proclaiming your worthiness. I mean, some folks don't struggle at touting their accomplishments, and others may have many accomplishments, but they lack the impulse, the confidence, the sense of importance to be able to describe it, feeling almost as though they are showing off somehow.
Yeah, there's a reconciliation process. And
Mm,
I think you're right. We're speaking to kind of one side of it where it's someone who is obviously not showing up in a confident way. And so, for example, I can think of one particular leader I work with who was promoted to vice president level. This is a healthcare person. This particular person was in um, um, the HR side of things. And the advice that she got from a female mentor that was super powerful and useful was say one thing in that executive meeting. Just get your voice in there once, mostly for yourself.
mm.
And that was something that she did in each meeting until she became confident and comfortable and felt she knew the context, etc. There's another side to this that I think is really important, Ray, that you bring up. There are folks who come across who are the ones who are taking up all the air in a meeting and speaking and behaving in those ways that seem super confident. And oftentimes, in my experience, when I've done a 360 assessment on someone and give them feedback, that's holding them back. They're
Right.
too confident, they're too brash, they do whatever it happens to be. And yet, what I find is that most of the time, the root that's underneath that is pretty similar. There's still that insecurity, that lack of confidence, whatever it is. That's just how it's manifesting itself differently.
Right. It's not to paint with too broad a brush, but it's the smartest kid in class syndrome of, we maybe we all remember the kids in grade school or high school who always had to be the smartest kid in class, and sometimes that betrayed something deeper that maybe was much less secure than it seemed.
I just had a client yesterday. I finished up with who I adore. This is a woman who had just been promoted up to a chair role, actually hired in from the outside. all kinds of gifts, everywhere. And what you just said, her big aha as we were wrapping up the entire engagement was exactly that. I've learned and realized that I have lived in a way that I always have to be the smartest person in the room. And
Mm.
from this past 6 months, I have learned that I actually am going to get more, do better, create more, get more of what we all kind of want here if I don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but I elevate others to be the smartest person in the room. Such a
Love it.
touching and moving revelation for that person to share.
Love it. I know you're a student of leadership styles, but think of the people who you know who can convey a smartest person in the room um, presence without talking all the time. That's a very powerful leadership style. It's the when this person speaks, everyone listens phenomenon.
Yes.
Anyways, so coaching. If you do a Google search, if someone says, "Hey, I think I'd like to find an executive coach," you'll find that there are many people out there who hang a shingle for coaching. So if someone has, sort of done the evaluation in terms of investment worthiness, they're at an inflection point, there's a sense of readiness, there's a feeling of being worthy and so forth, and they're thinking, yeah, I want to do this. How do you find one? How do
Mm.
you how do you get a good one?
To me, there's two parts. There's finding and there's choosing.
Hmm.
So, the finding, I can speak to that for 1 second. I think the simplest hint I can give is go to the International Coaching Federation website, the ICF website. They have a clearinghouse. That's a great place to start. There's just so much there, and that is kind of the core body. And I'm not paid by them, right? There's no affiliation there. They just kind of are the core place. Now, that's not the only place. There are tons of other places, but I found you go there, that'll be a great place to start to uncover some of the other places that one might go to start to kind of uncover coaches. That's a great place to go. Um, I've also found that we tend to underutilize our internal resources. When I worked inside a large organization, and large organizations have this more than smaller ones, that was my job. I would have somebody who would say, I think I need coaching. And I would be able to speak with them and say, do you? Right? And kind of have the conversation of what they might really need. And if they then really needed coaching, I became kind of an internal coaching practice manager and could help them find a coach. Sometimes that coach might be me, might be one of my staff, or somebody external. But oftentimes, large organizations have a big organization development function or something sitting somewhere in HR where they have somebody who can help with that. And the other thing I found is a lot of people know somebody. I know somebody out there who I think has been coaching. They'll be able to help you and tell you.
Yeah.
And if all else fails, contact me. We'll leave my contact information at the end of this. I'm glad to. I spent a lot of my time helping people find coaches, and I really enjoy that work.
Okay.
That's the finding. I think the choosing becomes really important.
Yeah.
And choosing is really about fit. So it's about talking to a few different people, getting clear on what it is that I really personally want, from my coach. And I have a list of questions that I often will suggest people ask that I would be glad to share with you if you want to put in the notes or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's
Happy.
a little bit about that too, the discernment process of what it is that I'm going to find as a good fit.
Perfect. So someone searches, finds, chooses. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, two things, Ted? The first is, what does the startup phase look like? How, when things get rolling, what is that like? And then over time, how can someone know if it's going well, if they're getting value from this, if they're getting their money's worth?
Yeah, great question. Let me take them, both of them are great. Let me take them one at a time. So for the first one, to simplify it, I would kind of say coaching. I think of it as three phases, and you talk about the first one. So the first one is a clarifying phase. That's really what's happening during the beginning. Then there's a working phase, and that's kind of you're just in kind of a groove. Then there's a wrap up phase, and the wrap up phase is really around checking before we wrap up. Did we kind of reach the goal that the coachee, the client set? What needs to be put in place to be able to continue after coaching is over? I had one person who said that they found me in the back of their head, and that's I don't wish that on anybody, but so the startup a lot of that really falls on the responsibility of the coach. As a coach, it's my job to structure this so that we move into this engagement, and I've been trained on how to kind of set that up. So it's not on the shoulders of the client, even though it is the client's journey. And it's a few different things. First of all, it's kind of about building trusts. So I'll oftentimes do some things in the beginning like, hey, can you answer these 10 questions? Just write it out about your life and who you are and your family, etc. So a little bit of, building the trust and getting to know each other a little bit, where to go, where not to go.
In conversation or in writing in advance, Ted?
Whatever works. I will ask my folks, would you mind filling this out and sending it back to me ahead of time? And if you do mind and you don't want to, no worries. We'll just talk about it, right? And most folks do submit it in writing, but I've had lots of folks who said, I want to actually talk this through with you first. Either way is completely fine. So once we've kind of had that getting to know you, I start pushing pretty hard right away on let's set some goals. The goal setting doesn't take place in one conversation, one meeting. They sort of evolve over a short period of time, but we need to begin thinking about that right away because, as Yogi Berra said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. At least I'm going to attribute that to Yogi Berra. Um, but so the idea of kind of starting to get clear on goals, and then there's some data gathering. I believe very strongly in data gathering. I believe if we're talking about behavior change, which is what really is at the core of coaching, I personally am not going to change my behavior unless I have some data and information that kind of goes against some of the things that I'm holding onto really tightly. So a 360 assessment that gathers information and input from people all around me, above, below, my peers, my customers. So we've established the working relationship. We have kind of set some preliminary goals. We've gathered some data. We then kind of locked in the goals. And then with formal executive coaching, then there's usually a conversation with the boss. Now, one last thing I want to really emphasize here is that everything that goes on in coaching is confidential. So we may be having this three-party meeting with the boss, but if you and I are working together, we spend a lot of time preparing for that. So you are deciding what from this assessment, what from your goals, what from our conversations you want to bring forward and what you don't. And then I am and we are both kind of adhering to that. And that lets us now start working on the actual kind of work of the coaching from there. That oftentimes takes several months to kind of go through all that process.
Is that common that you will engage a person, a person's boss, or others within the organization? And the reason I ask that is because I would imagine that sometimes you're working with clients whose objective is to leave a job or to elevate in another, position in another company, in which case confidentiality is doubly important.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's pretty common. I'll tell you what my CFO once said. My CFO, who was paying for a coaching program for basically, it was part of a leadership program where all of his managers got a certain amount of coaching, and then some got deeper coaching. And what he said was, "Life's too short." That was his line. He basically said, "Some of you, as a result of this, are going to have an aha that says, I need to leave this organization because I'm not happy here, or I need to go leave this organization and pursue my long lost hobby, or whatever. Life's too short. You need to do that." And his thinking was, in aggregate, it's kind of a win-win because if you are in a place where this is not the right place for you and you're deciding to go somewhere else, that's actually a good thing for you and for the organization when it comes down to it. And most people won't. So I think there's something in that. What I've also found, I have one client in particular who's in a very hard, untenable position and has a job offer outside. And what we've been able to do in the coaching is to look at his current job as if it's a job offer and the other job he's being offered and really kind of do some comparing back and forth. So it does come up. And in the meeting with the manager, I will say to my folks, you're going to have to share something with your boss that is compelling and they're going to have some say in that. But you may have one or two goals like that, and maybe you have one or two that are just ours inside the coaching, as well. And that's okay as well. But it's important to bring the boss in. It's a best practice. Research shows that when you evaluate the efficacy of coaching, that the coach, of course, rates it like 98%. Of course, we were effective. The client tends to rate it 95 or better. They tend to rate it really, really high, and then the boss tends to rate it in the 70s. And that's gotten much better since the best practice of involving the boss, right? And in particular, if you think about it, the boss, in essence, is sort of sponsoring and paying for this. On the flip side, it's also in the best interest of the client because the boss has a lot of control. Remember I said skill, will, environment? The boss has a lot of control over the environment. I recently had a three-party conversation with a client and the boss where I, as the coach, pushed pretty hard on the boss and their responsibility of creating conditions for success in the environment that the client could not do themselves. And that became a pretty powerful moment for both of them.
Interesting. So it's coach as broker, facilitator, intermediary in effect.
All the above. Yes. The way I like to think of it is we're going into this prepared, and the client, it's their meeting, and they're running it and they're leading it. but it's a new kind of meeting. So it sets up a different dynamic. For example, one of the defaults that often happens with my clients is they'll be working on business related goals. I'm going to improve profits. I'm going to improve engagement, all critical and important, really important stuff. And we can kind of get to that when we talk about the evaluation of efficacy of coaching. But as important as that is, the coaching is about the development of that individual to achieve those goals. And what oftentimes happens is the boss and the employee are working on that goal and not the development of the employee. So me being there, I'm watching for that and trying to bring about that kind of conversation. And yes, like you said, brokering it. If there are things that either party needs to be sharing or telling the other person that are really important and it's not coming out, I'm trying to help that come along because coaching takes place in a context. And what I'm trying to do is help make sure that the context is going to be as fertile as possible.
There's several questions that pop into my mind from that. Let's go to the funding one first. You mentioned, quote, it's the boss who is paying for it. Is that typical that an organization will pay for coaching, or is it more typical that an individual pays themselves for themselves?
I would say it's more common that the organization pays, but I have clients that fit in both spaces. I have one in particular who we're just beginning to talk about. In fact, what I love was this person said, I'm looking for coaching. And I said, okay, let's talk about me as a coach for you, but let me also offer you two other names to go talk to. So as we were having our conversation, one of the questions came up of like, okay, who's going to pay for this? And this person kind of said, okay, I feel that I need to pay for this because it's my own career development and I want to be able to feel like I'm working on deciding if I want to leave this place or not. I don't feel like that's right to ask my organization to pay for that. That's one line of thought, right? And this person then was going to be able to engage more fully in coaching as a result of that. Um, so I have a lot of that. I have a lot of people who, for various reasons, say, I'm going to be a self-pay. I can't get my organization to pay for it. Etc. There's a lot of different reasons. I typically tend to try to offer a different arrangement for them because it's harder for an individual to pay. So are there ways that I can kind of help them with that? But more often it's the organization. The organization says, I've got a high potential. I've got or we believe very strongly in coaching. We have a strong coaching program, and those I find are very, very effective because if an organization is very behind coaching, there tends to be what I call a coach-friendly organization, a coach-friendly environment.
Mm,
And when you've got that, there's a lot of things in place that go beyond coaching that create it's kind of sort of an all boats rise sort of environment.
excellent. Are there ever any ethical considerations in terms of, follow the money in terms of where the primary interests lie? So, if a company is paying, then the company is the client, and therefore you would think that you'd be wanting to serve their interests. But if you are coaching an individual and there may be a divergence of interests, what do you do then?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I go all the way back to my days as an employee assistance counselor, where confidentiality was almost legality, right? It was almost like so confidentiality is the coin of the realm. It's critical on all different levels. And coaching is a coaching engagement is only as good as the contract that is written about it, right? So there's contracting that is part of the opening phase. Contracting includes, okay, what are the limits of confidentiality? What does that mean? Where are they limited? Confidentiality is always limited ethically if someone is going to be a harm to themselves or others.
Mm.
So at one point, for example, I had a person who was really beginning to have some pretty severe mental health issues. And it became very, very clear this is impacting their work, of course. With their permission, I then began to reach out and work with others in the organization to help them get the mental health support that they needed. So in a sense, you could say I quote broke confidentiality, but I did it in a way that that I thought was very sort of respectful, right, and with their permission, right. Um, but more importantly, what you're kind of talking about is navigating and negotiating the confidentiality with both parties. So if I'm going to engage with the organization, I need to be able to say, look, you have to respect that coaching is not going to work if it is not confidential. I have to be able to speak with this person. They have to be able to speak freely inside that space. Now, then let's negotiate then what you need. And most of the time, where it lands on is like, I need to know they're working on at least a couple of goals that are going to, make them more valuable to this organization or add value to the organization, et cetera. And so let's look at what those are. Most of the time, what we do is we negotiate an action plan that's usually in writing, and that is oftentimes public. And I'm doing this with air quotes, public, in that the boss sees it. Maybe there's someone in HR who's managing the coaching practice that sees it, right? But so we're talking about it on that level, and then some checkpoints. So I talked about meeting with the boss up front. So there's some alignment. Okay, I want to work on these two things. The boss says, okay, this makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about what support you need. And then also, as we get toward the end, we're about to get to the end here. Have we kind of met? Have we met the goals? Are we going where we need to go? I just recently worked with a client, for example, whose goal was to become a vice president, and they reported up to a chief medical officer. And so we had this really good agreement and several three-party meetings where it was always kind of about what else needs to happen in order for you to feel like this person is now ready to be promoted to vice president. So there's a lot of work in there. And at the same time, inside that coaching engagement, there's a little bit of the, what if I don't get the vice president role? What will I do then? Can that be part of our coaching, kind of thing? So anyway, I'll stop there because I'm starting to kind of ramble here, Ray, but it's such a great question. And you can tell it's not a simple, easy answer, but it really boils down to the power of the agreement and the contract up front.
Got it. Well, I guess like all contracts, the more you can anticipate and clarify upfront, that the better off you'll be down the line. Is there such a thing, Ted, as the most typical things that people work on in coaching? A top couple list of the issues that are most prevalent in your practice and in the typical executive coach's practice?
Yeah, I would say navigating a new role is super, super common. Whenever we have a bend in the pipeline, kind of going down the management road, if you will, three things change. One of them is the way we think about the skills, right? So a new set of skills are required. The second is kind of the things I value in this new role. What should I be valuing now that I didn't value before? It's things that may even be beyond I don't know what I don't know, right? And the third is around time. I have a different relationship with time and the time horizon. In my last role, maybe I had to think a week out because I had to set the schedule for everybody. But as CEO, I have to think 10 years out. So there's a lot of adjustment, and it's the what got you here won't get you there. So a lot of work I find goes in that place. What was it that was working for you before that maybe a strength overplayed and be holding you back? That's a real common one. And that's a really fruitful place to be. That's a value to everybody because coaching can accelerate the onboarding and effectiveness in that role. It can take months out of the amount of time it takes, which is a value to everybody. Another one we mentioned before, it's that imposter syndrome, the confidence, space and place. Most folks experience that in some way, but how is that holding you back? How is that? Is it just a sense of internal duress that you want to sort of get rid of, or is it actually preventing you from taking steps and doing things that you might need to do otherwise? And as I mentioned before, that is one that shows up across the board for folks, everywhere, especially folks who show up in sort of high level roles, especially in I'll say kind of highly hierarchical, positional organizations. Healthcare is one of them, industries. And I think oftentimes shows up in women. It's more common in women that they'll bring it forward to work on it. Some of that, in my experience, is that it's my women clients tend to be more at home with acknowledging that in a lot of ways as well. But those are some of the key ones that I work with a lot.
Okay, great. Well, you alluded to this a few minutes ago, this notion that we all exist within a specific context. And it's, our context is based on our history, our experiences, our values,
Mm.
and of course the organizational culture that within which we're operating. In your experience, what conditions need to be present for coaching to be successful in any, given context or culture?
The first thing I'm going to go back and double down on is readiness for the individual receiving the coaching. They just simply have to be ready. The context, the environment it has a big impact on that, of course. If I'm working in an environment where I don't feel safe to kind of exploring these kinds of things, then the coaching isn't even going to get off the ground in the beginning. But the individual has to be ready. And one of the things that I've been working on a lot as I look at readiness, I once had a mentor who's a wonderful coach who kind of said, I asked the question like, why is it that coaching works sometimes and it doesn't other times? And he said, readiness. It comes down to readiness. For me, that's not quite good enough. How do we think about readiness? How do we define readiness? What is it? How do we know if someone's ready? And how do we bring it about? And the last one, how do we bring it about? A lot of that resides in the culture and the environment.
Mhm.
So that's I think one. Another thing that I found really powerful is having a champion or a sponsor of power somewhere in the organization. And when I say power, what I'm really kind of talking about is someone who is recognized, right? Whether because they're charismatic or because they hold the purse strings. I mentioned my CFO client who I had before. This was a really good, strong advocate that I had. Someone who really can kind of say, no, this is normal, this is good, this is expected. Um, and it's very easy to take coaching and have it become something that is viewed as punitive. It's very easy for that to happen, very hard to build a climate and a culture where it's viewed as something that's positive. I once ran a coaching program internally as part of a leadership development program. All the managers in the department got a coach for a short period of time through this process. Then we offered a follow-on coaching as part of it. That was something else that this particular sponsor said is really, this is so important. I wanted to continue to be part of it. What started to happen was people saw the coaches arriving to coach someone they know had been to the program a year earlier. And they said, what's wrong with that person? And you can start to see it kind of erode a little bit. So we had to kind of keep being vigilant about, no, coaching is an investment. It's a resource. It's a good thing. And it helps to have a sponsor that can kind of do that. And then the last thing I would say is I just think that all the things that make a good culture, right? Oftentimes measured by employee engagement, for example, all the things that go into that, trust in senior leadership, development is okay, a tolerance for a certain level of experimentation and mistakes, all those things that make a good environment in general also make a good coaching environment, and it's symbiotic. If you have a lot of folks who are experiencing all those things that make for good coaching outcomes, you're also improving the environment.
That's great. Perfect fit to a recurring theme in these interviews that I've been doing on the podcast is this notion of culture,
Mm.
transforming culture, improving culture, changing culture, and so forth. Speaking of which, maybe more broadly, I know we've been talking about individual one-on-one coaching. Do you work with groups? Do you work with larger, departments, divisions, entire companies? I mean, is there a global version of this?
Yeah, so it's a really well put the way you said that. So there's the way I look at it, let's simplify for our conversation. Let's look at three levels. There's the individual coaching, which we've been talking about. There's team-based coaching, which has become a discipline in of itself. And then there's this larger, let's just call it global for a moment, organizational, kind of wherever you put it. Starting with that last one, we kind of just began to delve into that just a little bit, right? How can we think about coaching as a very powerful intervention that is going to help us with our culture? So a lot of what I worked on when I was internal was thinking about how can we think about coaching as one of the tools that we use, and how can we use it in a cost-effective investment way. Um, let's make sure that for example, that we are not paying for coaching in one-offs all over the organization. Let's centralize it so we know how much money we're spending on coaching, where we're spending it, who we're spending it on, and that we're spending it, in places where it has high benefit, and if there are other interventions that might be more appropriate, that we're using those, right? So on that level, there's a way of looking at it that way, and so that's part of what I spent time internally doing, is really looking at how can we use this powerful intervention in a way that's going to be really impactful.
Got it.
We've talked a whole bit about individual coaching. All of what we're talking about is really predicated on that. And what has started to happen over the last 10 years, certainly, maybe even longer, I suppose, has been folks have said, okay, I see the power in this intervention. This is really powerful. Let's use this. But it's super expensive if you think about it one after another. How do we think about it at scale? And that's when group coaching began to come into play, or team coaching is what it's being called. To me, it's a different thing. The core of coaching around space for reflection, building a trusting environment, asking good questions, all that stuff applies, but I'm also an expert facilitator, and I bring all those things to facilitation as well, right? So I think there's a lot of overlap from that perspective. What we're starting to see happen now, with certifications and with structure coming around team coaching, is it's starting to become its own thing. Where
Mhm.
what you're also doing is, in addition to all those best practices, you're also leveraging the individuals who are part of that to kind of coach each other. So I see it as super, super powerful. And I see there's a slight difference between team coaching and individual coaching. So that if you're going to use one or the other, really kind of know what you're doing, versus I can get more bang for my buck if I do team coaching for folks. Know that it's a little bit different than
Okay.
individual coaching.
Okay. I'm sure that's a very important distinction. I wanna switch to some of the questions that you like to ask folks. You already mentioned how do you process inspiration as a good question, and I'm sure you have others. Um, I think it would be interesting for listeners to hear those questions so that they can evaluate whether or not these are the kinds of questions they want to answer, but also just for them to maybe begin pondering themselves for their own careers. This podcast is aimed mostly towards leaders of organizations, and so what are some of the kinds of questions you like to ask leaders?
Um, so how many days you got, right? One of the
Seven,
things
7 days. Let's do it.
one of the things that I've worked really hard on trying to do is build up a kind of a back pocket reserve of questions because some work, some don't, and some work for some people and some don't for some people. So I offer variety, but one that became particularly valuable, especially in the core, like when COVID was really upon us and was really we were all in the grip of it. There was a whole coaching seminar that was all on the single question of how are you?
Hmm.
Just simply how. And if you truly ask that question in the context of a coaching relationship where you build trust, et cetera, and you really mean it. I did this just the other day with a particular client, and it turns out the client um, didn't get fired, but just got sort of moved in a way that feels like a demotion. And that question of how are you was such a powerful moment. It led to really this deep back and forth kind of exchange. So how are you? If you really mean it, is a really useful,
Yep.
powerful question.
Well, we're
Um,
all, multi-layered onions. I guess the question is, at what depth do you want to answer that question?
exactly, and that's the client's choice.
Right.
And as coach, I'm always going with their road trip. So if the client, in this particular case, they went real deep. Another case, I had a client who was like, "Ah, I am doing great. I just had a vacation. Can I tell you about my kids?" Like so. It goes where they go, but it's a diagnostic as well. It lets me kind of get a feel for where they are, so I can start to kind of match and move into their space.
That's great.
Another one I love in the beginning of an engagement, I use this sometimes, especially when I'm kind of feeling playful. Is, okay, what's one good thing that's happened this week? And so that's when I'm feeling playful, when it's sort of fun, when it seems like it might be useful for them. Sometimes that's useful too when I get a sense of they've been fighting a lot of battles. I have one person who just moved into a new role as a chair, and every week she just felt like she was just fighting battles on every front. So I kind of started her there, and she laughed was the first thing she did. She's like, "Wait, I got to think about this for a minute." So that's another one that I like. Some questions too, as we get a little bit deeper into a conversation, and I can see in particular if a person's beginning to ramble a bunch. To me, that says there's some clarity that's not there for them. There's something they're working on here. What's going on? So then I'll sometimes ask a question. I may even have to interrupt and ask a question and say, "What do you really want in this
Mm,
situation?"
mm,
And that oftentimes is a pattern interrupter and kind of helps them get where they need to go. There's something I'll ask not as frequently because I think oftentimes it can be, unless there's a deep bond of trust, it can feel like a salesman-y question, like, what's going to take it to put you in this car today? So I will only ask this if the environment is right, but I'll ask like, if you had what you needed, if you had this particular thing in this situation you're saying you don't have, whatever it happens to be, I'll name their words, but if you had this, what would you do? Or if you had this, what would be possible for you? Or if you had this, how would things be different for you? Um, right. And, if someone's not ready for that question, it's an awful question. But if someone's ready for that question and they're kind of ready to go to that place, oftentimes it comes when they're sort of sick of the limitation that they're finding themselves in. So I think those are a few. I guess, one other that I will oftentimes ask is simply the why not question.
mm,
Um, Someone once asked that of me when I was kind of talking low of myself, of course, I never do this and this and this. Why not? Why not you? Well, and the answer might not be that I should do that thing, but just the idea of at least kind of going to this place of answering why not. There's something in the power of answering that question. So those are a few. What I'm looking for more is questions that are going to help put the burden of discovery on them, as opposed to me holding it and saying, I'm going to ask a question that's going to lead you down a path to come to a certain kind of insight. I really want to have questions that are going to help you kind of get to a deeper realization than you may have had before.
okay. Um, Last question. How are you? No, I'm kidding. What's your biggest challenge in doing
You are
this
very
work?
coachable, by the way, Ray.
I'm following here, but what's when you've been doing this for a while, um, what challenges you, and what sometimes is difficult about this work?
Yeah. I mean, such a good question. I think for me, a lot of it comes down to how I show up. I think that's kind of the headline, how I show up. So, for example, literally during any course of any given day, I'm like most of us, right? I overbook myself. I have too many meetings. And that means that I'm getting exhausted. I may not be showing up in a particular meeting for a client. And, I mentioned some of the challenges some of my clients face. And if I'm going to show, I need to be able to show up for them. So, am I building in enough time to be able to ground myself and make sure I'm showing up, as really the client deserves? That's one challenge. I'm always sort of challenging myself around that. Another is there's a notion that one of my mentors once said, never work harder than your client. And I've done that on a lot of occasions. And that's a challenge I face. And oftentimes it's motivated by a bunch of different things. My own, imposter syndrome, right? And it may very well be, I know this organization is expecting this particular meeting to happen, and I'm going to have to answer to the HR VP who's paying me for this engagement. Therefore, this client has to do this when the client isn't ready for this, or that it's not what's best for the client, et cetera. And so having to kind of slow my roll a little bit and say, no, 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 I'm going to be meeting the client where the client's at. Getting overinvested, I just like, I get so, one of my clients came through fairly recently. I alluded to them before, the person who was looking for this VP role. The coaching was about getting ready for the VP role. And when the camera came on their badge, now it said vice president on their badge. I got all excited, and your listeners can't see, but I just wiggled in my chair, right? But I got so excited, and that's on its surface, that's a really good thing, to be that connected and invested. But it can take a toll if I'm overly invested in their success. One, am I not showing up in a way that's helping them to kind of go where they need to go, where they're ready to go? But more importantly, for my own well-being. I found, especially when I have clients who are really struggling. I have one in particular right now who is wrestling with resilience.
Mhm.
This is someone who is in an organization that's gone through tremendous change. You sort of talk about the waterfall, right? This person's been like sitting on the edge of that waterfall with their organization and being the one to give them certainty. A
Mhm.
lot of our conversation has been around that's really not the right move. Certainty is not something that anyone can give, and certainly that's not even necessarily an expectation that's helpful for anyone right now. And so this person has been kind of wrestling with that, and I've been seeing their resilience erode, and I've been feeling it myself for them, and I've had to really do some work to pull back and be like, this is their journey, and I can help them better with their journey if I can sit with my feet on solid ground, and have them kind of be floating out there. So those are a few of the things that I wrestle with.
That's great. I mean, this notion of potentially becoming over invested is interesting. It's the therapist, chaplain, caregiver in general conundrum, and the need for some healthy separation. And it sounds as though coaches experience the same dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yep.
What surprises you? I mean, again, you've been doing this for a while. Are there any lessons learned that you'd like to share, or surprises, things that come up that keep this fresh and new and help you to continue to learn and feel motivated?
I love that last sort of twist you put on this. Such a great way to think about this. And I think for me and for everyone I know who's a coach, we are always seeking that, right? This idea of like, okay, coaching could become very rote. I have had times when I've had allowed myself to take on too many clients. And if it gets too rote, then it's not good for anybody. So fortunately for me, there is a ton inside my coaching, almost every single meeting. I'm surprised by, well, for example, especially early on in my coaching, by some of my own biases. Times when the notion that the person in front, that 2% rule, the person in front of me has what they need, that they are creative, resourceful, and whole, when I've really uncovered that I'm not letting myself believe that around this person for whatever reason. I have one client, I had a very unfair bias. This is a person who was working in government. And I had a number of other clients from the same department that was really, they were having a really, really hard time. All of them to a person kind of said, yeah, it's terrible and it's really hard, but if I'm 15 years away from pension, I'll just stick it out.
Mm.
And so I had this sort of image that I imbued with this one client who was like, I am so much, we're so much more than this. And this person surprised me, and she shouldn't have, like she really shouldn't have. Like I should have seen this client has this resilience and this gift, etc. So I've been surprised in that way. I've been, I think, oftentimes surprised just at the pure joy that I feel in two ways. I think the pure joy that I felt with being next to people, that are, remember I said before that I'm not necessarily going to be the leader, but I can be next to one.
Right.
I have had the privilege of coaching some folks that are just absolutely amazing human beings. There's this, I'll give one example of someone who is just really going to be, somebody relatively early, kind of getting to mid-career, someone who was really well respected in infectious disease, and then along came COVID, and this person's gifts shined during that time, and they exploded to the system level in their system, to the state level, and started to move national. And so to me, what was kind of surprising, what keeps me going, is the joy that I feel at being able to be connected to in any way, shape, or form someone with those kind of gifts. And then the thought partnership. I get so much joy out of just being able to think with really smart people. And there's two in particular that are coming to my mind right now. Both of them happen to be physicians. One's working in pharma right now, but just we start, and 5 minutes in, and we are in this place of such incredible depth that I would never have gone to had it not been being connected to this person in their thought process. And then the last thing I'll say is kind of a more negative thing, and this is I think I've been surprised, especially lately, witnessing the limitations of what I said before about the person in front of me is creative and resourceful and whole. I've seen the limits of that.
Mm.
And, in some ways there's some shame with that, right? Because as a coach, no, every individual is creative, resourceful, and whole. I've seen some people arrive not being whole, being really, really in such a less than whole place because of the environment, the world, even go back to COVID, right? There's so many things that are going on, and the speed that folks are finding themselves in. I'm just finding folks really wrestling more so, I think, in the last few years than I have ever seen before. That surprised me a little bit. The amount of difficulty these incredibly gifted people have in just being resilient and showing up each day.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm hearing a lot in your response to that this is very energizing for you, very rewarding for you, but also on that last point, I mean, it sounds to me as though the executive coaching in general role is one of accompaniment, and that means, you are accompanying individuals through the various hills and valleys of their own experience, and as you just pointed out, there have been some valleys that
Mm.
you've walked alongside folks through.
Yeah, yeah, really well put. Kind of going back to earlier, some of the challenges, right? Then being resilient when walking through that, because it doesn't help me, but certainly it also doesn't help the other person, doesn't help the coach. Yeah.
Fantastic. The title of this episode has been Is Now the Time to Consider Executive Coaching? So I'm hoping that listeners who may be thinking about this will have learned quite a bit. I think this has been a good overview, maybe for some a real introduction, but also some really surprising and probing, thoughtful questions and issues have come up. So I'm grateful, Ted, for your willingness to share all that and for the work that you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for including me, and thanks for the conversation. You and I fortunately get to sometimes have conversations outside of this, and they always feel like this to me. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, we've taken it and we've recorded it for all the world to share and listen in on. And if people want to learn a little bit more about you, what you do, you very generously offered to help folks if they would like to discern this further and maybe find a good coach. How can people find you out there in the vast world that we live in?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I really do mean that. I imagine you don't have too many listeners. Just kidding. But no, I really do mean that. And so, yes, if folks want to contact me, LinkedIn is probably the best way. Ted Witherell. Interestingly, I'm really one of the only Ted Witherells out there, interestingly enough. So finding me on LinkedIn, and my email is tedwitherell@gmail.com. And certainly if you want to put those both in the show notes. But I do welcome if folks want to reach out to me by email. I will help in any way that I can that seems appropriate to you. That's where to find me.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Ted.
Thank you, Ray.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your platform of choice. That will help others find us here. My mission is to help empower organizations that matter by supporting those who lead them. Feel free to learn more about me and my work at redsaleadvisors.com.